Greetings and welcome to tonight's study in the Word. My name is Bruce Logan, and tonight we're continuing with our study that we began. And it's amazing how time flies because this is actually lesson number 19. And we're on the study that we're called Keys to Unlocking God's Big Story of the Bible. And tonight we're going to be continuing with that study, and we're going to be looking at the book of First Samuel. But before we get to that, let me just first of all bring my screen up, and let's get that out of the way. And then we're going to just do a quick, as you know, kind of what I'd like to do, because there's maybe individuals who may be viewing this study for the first time and maybe joining it for the first time. And so I kind of like to give an overview quickly of what exactly we're talking about and what we mean when we talk about God's big story of the Bible. So we're looking at this, the title, God's Big Story of the Bible. And the basic premise is that we're trying to demonstrate how the Bible is so much more than we were taught in Sunday school, in that the Bible is not just a mere collection of inspirational stories and inspirational characters and lessons, in which it is all of that, so don't think for a second that I'm dismissing that in any way. But what I'm pointing out in this particular study is demonstrating that the Bible is that and more. The Bible is actually one big story. Even though it consists of 66 books, it's actually one book that tells one big story, and this one book has 66 chapters in it. That's kind of a good way of looking at it. And the one big story is God's plan of redemption for humanity. And so, in other words, the long and the short of it is that when God created Adam and Eve, when God created the heavens and the earth, he looked and said everything was good. Not only was it good, but it was very good. But something interrupted and corrupted that good creation that God created, and that was the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Sin entered into the world, and God at that point had a decision to make. He could have either destroyed Adam and started all over again from scratch, or he could have done, which he did end up doing, is he implemented a plan of redemption. Then that plan involved the virgin birth, death, burial, and resurrection of his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, and his soon return to establish his kingdom up here on earth. And the Bible tells us in Revelation that John, when he observed, he said, and he saw, and God made all things new. And so when the story of how we got from the fall to how we got to Revelations 22, where it says all things are made new, all of that encompasses what we refer to as God's big story. And in the studies that we're currently engaged in is the first part of that narrative, in which we are looking at the big story of the Old Testament. And the big story of the Old Testament, what we've done in order to demonstrate that is that we've highlighted and focused on 11 books of the Old Testament that we refer to as foundational books, or the 11 foundational books. And we refer to these 11 foundational books, or we refer to these 11 books as foundational books, simply because as we know, or if you've studied the Old Testament at any point in time, you know that the books or the canon that we have in our Old Testament, canon, is not listed, or the books aren't listed in their proper all of their proper chronological or historical sequence, or in other words, the order or the sequence, historically speaking, in which the events actually took place. But there is 11 books that we refer to as foundational books that are in their proper chronological and historical sequence or in order, and all the other 28 Old Testament books actually occurred during the time frame of one of these 11 foundational books, or they supplement or complement one of these 11 foundational books in one way or another. And so real quickly, these 11 books are, and I want to encourage everybody especially if those of you who are joining us for the first time in this study, try to memorize these 11 foundational books of the Old Testament. And I want to go stick my neck out on the line and say that if you can master these 11 books, then your understanding and comprehension of the Old Testament as a whole is going to expand at a level that you can't even really comprehend at the moment. Your understanding level is going to it's going to explode. And so these 11 books are Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, First Samuel. Of course, we're going to be in First Samuel tonight, and then this book 7, Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These are 11 foundational books, and these 11 books give us the historical and chronological big picture storyline of the Old Testament, which in this big picture storyline tells the story of 7 periods in Israel's history. In other words, as we're going to discover tonight, for an example, when we're going to actually unpack the third of those 7 periods, but there are 7 periods in Israel's history, 7 isolated time frames in the history of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament that are clearly identifiable, again, as we will see clearly tonight. And these 7 periods in Israel's history are covered in the 11 foundational books. And so basically what this is doing, by understanding these 11 foundational books and recognizing the 7 separate periods in Israel's history, basically you have a complete, encompassed overview of the entirety of the Old Testament. And again, this is the premise in which we're presenting this particular study. In other words, what we're doing is instead of going verse by verse by verse, we're taking a big picture. That's why we're calling it the big story, or the big picture of the Old Testament. And so by understanding this big picture, what we're doing is that rather than going verse by verse in each of the books, we're taking what I like to refer to as the 10,000 foot view of the Old Testament. And it's easy to do when you examine the Old Testament through the lens of these 11 foundational books and the 7 periods of Israel's history. Now, this 7 periods of Israel's history, real quickly, and I want to get through this because I got a lot I want to cover and tonight, so I want to dive right in. But I want to point out once again these 7 periods, and these 7 periods of Israel's history that are clearly identifiable, and where we transition from one period to the next, and which we're clearly going to see that again tonight, is the period of formation. The period of formation is referred to as that is because when God called Abraham, he promised him to make him a great nation from his descendants. Well, Abraham didn't have any children, his wife was barren, and they were both elderly. And so God literally had to form a nation literally from scratch. And God, of course, miraculously did that. And the story, and basically from Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis 50, is I like to refer to as the big story of the patriarchs. And it's the big story of the patriarchs in which God was able to establish the people in which would eventually become a nation. And then we had, and once of course the formation period concluded with the conquering and the division of the land in the book of Joshua. And then the period after that, which we unpacked last week, was the second period, was the Theocracy period, and this is the period of the judges. And we're going to actually be into part of the Theocracy period, or the period of the judges, tonight. And that period actually runs from Judges chapter 1 all the way through 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 17. We'll see that tonight. Then of course, then the kingdom the people transition to the third period of their history, which we refer to as the United Kingdom period, in which all 12 tribes were united under one king. And then, of course, they became divided after the death of Solomon. And then in 2 Kings chapter 17, it records the invasion of the Assyrians into the northern kingdom and conquering the northern kingdom and taking them into captivity. And once that took place at the conclusion of 2 Kings 17, which we'll get to eventually, there is no more mention of the 10 northern tribes. The only thing that remains, or the only tribe that remains, is the single kingdom of Judah, which is to the south, which consisted of Judah and Benjamin. And of course, that was referred to as the single kingdom period. And then, of course, Judah, they had a reprieve because, as we'll see when we get to that, that they did have at least a few godly kings. And so they actually, got an extended period of grace, you might say, because of that. But eventually, they also had to be punished by God, and God allowed the Babylonians to come and take them into captivity, and they remained in captivity for 70 years. And at the conclusion of that 70 years, there was a king by the name of Cyrus that wrote a decree that just as Jeremiah had predicted and prophesied, that God would allow them to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls of the city. And these two events, the period of restoration, occurs in accumulation of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And of course, in this chart that we've shown a few times during the course of this study, and if you can notice horizontally here, that you can see that these 11 foundational books are listed. And then you can also see that where each of the supplemental books, or the 28 supplemental books, tie into or are connected in one way or another, or supplement or complement in one way or another, one of these 11 foundational books. So even this chart alone will go a long way into really kind of help us to understand the big picture of the Old Testament. So now, with all of that review out of the way, we're going into the sixth foundational book tonight, which is the book of First Samuel. And we refer to this period as the rise of the kingdom, or the first, or the period of the united kingdom, where all 12 tribes are united under one king. And of course, that didn't go quite well, especially initially. So now, I want to do a brief summary on the book of First Samuel. And again, just keep in mind, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, especially those of you who have been with me for a while, you kind of know this. But we're just taking a 10,000-foot view of the Old Testament, and more specifically, a 10,000-foot view of the 11 foundational books. So we're doing a summary or a 10,000-foot view of the book of First Samuel. We're not going to necessarily go verse by verse, although there are some important passages that we're going to spend time and just take a look at while we're here in First Samuel. So now, the book of First Samuel marks a very pivotal period in the transition in the nation of Israel. A period of transition. It's in other words, the First Samuel is a transitional book, and when we get to chapter 8, we're going to see that that's a transitional chapter, where they literally transition from one period, from the theocracy period, to a centralized united kingdom period. Remember that during the judges, it wasn't not a centralized people. In other words, every individual tribe, whenever they needed a judge, whenever they were being oppressed, that God will send a judge, and he would basically minister or judge or fight for them, or that particular tribe in that particular territory. Now, for the first time, when we get to First Samuel, we're going to have just one united king, where all 12 tribes are going to be united under one individual, as we're going to see in a little bit. Now, and these united kings, there were 3 united kings in the history of the nation of Israel. These united kings were, first of all, Saul, then David, and then, of course, Solomon. And it's kind of interesting to note that each of these 3 united kings all served for exactly 40 years. So I just thought that was a little interesting side note. But then also, I just want to point out that there's the land territory that under David, especially, that Saul as well, the land or the territory expanded, and they went from where the land area under Joshua that was conquered, and under Saul, and actually under David more so, that the land area was expanded through conquest even more exponentially. So we're gonna see that as we go and unpack the lives of Saul and David and Solomon. So that's an important period, the United Kingdom period that we're in. Now, The book of First Samuel itself, just like again, a brief summary of the book itself, can be divided into three key narratives. And we're going to just take a brief look at each of these three narratives as we go forward tonight. Now, the life of Samuel is recorded in chapters 1, or the first part of the narrative, rather, is mostly primarily dealing with Samuel and the life of Samuel, especially his younger days. And that's in chapter 1 through chapters 12. And then we're going to talk about the rise and the fall of King Saul. Chapter 13 through 31 records the rise and the fall of King Saul. And then finally, the third narrative that actually carries on into the book of Second Samuel is the early rise of David and his preparation to become king, from whose line came the King of Kings. And that's an important notation to note, because that's in keeping with the theme of this study, that God's big picture of the Bible. In other words, when we really begin to unpack David, which we'll do more of David next week, and when we get to Second Samuel, because the Second Samuel is all about the life of David primarily. So when we get to that, you're going to begin to see that the Bible is more than just a collection. In other words, when we read about David and Goliath, for an example, or David and Bathsheba, David just was another example of an individual that God used in order to fulfill his big picture plan of redeeming humanity. And it was through David's line that Jesus would be born. And so that's an important notation to keep in mind, in keeping with our theme of the Bible being one big story, because we're going to see all of these connecting threads throughout this study. And or the life of David is a major connecting thread. So I want you to just kind of keep that in mind, because we'll unpack David and why his life was so significant more so next week. So now, the life of First Samuel, early on of Samuel's life and call, the focus is on Samuel's life and call. I talked about the focus is like on his prophetic ministry and his efforts to guide Israel through some spiritual and political upheaval. Now, Samuel, whose name means heard of God, was dedicated to God by his mother Hannah. And most of you are familiar with that story, very familiar story that we learned back when we were in Sunday school. Hannah was barren, and of course, back in that time, it was, if a woman was barren, especially beyond a certain age, that was very humiliating, to say the least. And so she went to the right in front of the door of the tabernacle, and she began to just pray, and she just prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed, and she fervently prayed. And it was to the point where the prophet Eli, rather, he wasn't a prophet, he was the priest Eli, actually thought that she may have been drunk. And when he approached her, God, she basically explained, what her request was to God, and God would eventually grant her request, and gave her a son. And Hannah named him Samuel, and dedicated Samuel to the Lord. And after Samuel had been weaned, just as she had promised Eli, she brought him to the door of the tabernacle. And from that point on, he began to serve Eli in the priesthood. Now, the thing that made that interesting, or a little bit different, because traditionally, it was always the sons of the priests who are, as a matter of fact, this is according to what we studied when we were when we talked about the book of Leviticus. And while they were camped at Mount Sinai, when they were given the law, part of that was that it was the priestly line, or the Levites, who were in charge of everything that's dealing with the priesthood. But however, Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were so corrupt and so immoral that God was about to get rid of them and put Samuel in their place. Now, notice what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 17 as it relates to the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. Wherefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. So what was taking place is that they were showed such disrespect and disregard for the offerings of the Lord. And remember when we were talking about the offerings and the burnt offerings and all the various offerings that had to be, if you remember that picture, or that image of the tabernacle and the courtyard and the brazen altar where all the sacrifices were done inside the gate. And some of you, I'm sure you will remember that. And I won't go back and really show that again, but that's kind of giving you a visual of what was taking place. That they were using corrupt. They were just absolutely corrupted. Where the other men in the camp were so abhorred by the deeds of Eli's two sons that they just didn't even want to bring an offering because it was just so Eli's two sons were just so corrupt. Now, and then in verse, if that wasn't bad enough, let's look what it says in 1 Samuel 2:22. It says, "Now Eli was old, and he had heard all that his sons did unto all Israel." Now, I want to stick a pin right there just for a moment. Eli heard about what his sons did, but he didn't do anything about it. I mean, he just allowed it to go on, and he didn't do anything to chastise them, at least not according to the text. And he just apparently just like turned a blind eye. And how they lay and notice he heard all what they did, and this is how corrupt they had became. Not only did they corrupt the offerings of the Lord, but notice what else they did, and how they lay with women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, just stop and think about that for a moment, especially if you were with us when we were teaching on the tabernacle and the sacredness of the tabernacle, and how the entrance to the tabernacle represented the only way to get to God, which was through Jesus Christ. And now, if you can just kind of visualize that in your mind, and you can kind of get an idea of just how abominable this act was in the eyes of God. And so God obviously, was not going to continue to allow that to stand. Now let's notice something that happens in when we transition to 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3 describes 3 times in which Samuel heard what he believed at the time was Eli calling him during the night. And after the third call, Eli himself realized, because Samuel would go in and he would say, he would inquire of Eli, I hear you. What do you want, basically? And Eli, after the third time, he realized he knew it wasn't him. So he realized that it had to be God speaking to Samuel. So he gave him instructions to how to respond the next time. And on the fourth call, Samuel finally said, or followed Eli's instructions and said, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And God gave, and this was interesting, that God gave Samuel a message of judgment to relate to Eli because of the evil that his sons was committing. And also, I believe that it was also the judgment that was due to the fact that Eli allowed it to continue, even though he knew about it and didn't do anything about it. So the following day, Samuel told Eli everything, who then responded with acceptance. In other words, Eli recognized, this is bad. And that had to have been from God. And so he basically didn't put up a fight. He accepted it. Now notice, while still this took place. Now this is really interesting. Now, because understanding the time frame and the context, as we proceed through this is kind of important. So it's important to keep in mind that we're still in the period of the judges, where the United Kingdom haven't quite taken place yet. So in chapter 4, it was still during the period of the judges. And one of the things I need to point out also that's interesting about Samuel is that Samuel was also considered the last judge. He actually had 2 sons, as we'll read about here in a moment, that were also judges, but they weren't like Samuel. They were sort of corrupt and they were more like Hophni and Phineas than they were like their father Samuel. But First Samuel 4 records the Philistines' attack on Israel. Now, and it's important, if you remember again, we went back to the book of Judges. Remember, we're still in the period of the Judges, by the way. We're still in that theocracy period. And remember that the book of Judges was characterized by this sin cycle where the people would sin, God would chastise them, they would repent, and then he would send a judge, they would be delivered. So we're still in that sin cycle in the first part of First Samuel. So that's important to kind of keep in mind, to have that backdrop in your mind as we go through this chapter 4 and see exactly what took place when the Philistines attacked Israel. So let's look at, we're gonna just read through some scripture, and we're gonna look at First Samuel chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out against the Philistines to battle and pitched beside Ebenezer. And the Philistines pitched at Apec. Verse 2 says, and the Philistines put themselves in array against Israel. And when they joined battle, Israel was smitten before the Philistines, and they slew of the army in the field about 4,000 men. So Israel, in this one battle, they get defeated, they lose 4,000 men. 4,000 men are killed in this one battle with the Philistines. And verse 3 says that when the people were come into the camp, those who survived the battle, when they came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, wherefore hath the Lord smitten us to this today before the Philistines? Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when the ark comes among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. That's an important notation, because at the time they assumed they assumed that by bringing the ark, and basically they were going by past history under Joshua, under Moses. Of course, this may have been the case, but something was different, drastically different in this particular scenario. That the results wasn't what they were expecting. And verse 4 tells us, so the people sent to Shiloh that they might bring from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, which dwells between the cherubims, and the two sons. Now this is the part to keep in mind. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant. So these two corrupt individuals they came along with the ark of the covenant, thinking, we're gonna kind of dismiss these guys' past sins, and we're gonna have them bring the ark. And by putting the ark forward, we'll be able to defeat the Philistines. But it didn't quite work out the way they thought. So let's look at verse 5. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again. I kind of sometimes when I'm teaching this in class or doing this in a group Bible study, I kind of jokingly say this, kind of like they had like the church service of all church services. They shouted with a great shout so that the earth rang out. And it was and they shouted so much that when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, what meaneth the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews? And they understood that the ark of the Lord was come into the camp. Now, and the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is come into their camp. And they said, woe unto us, for there hath not been such a thing before. Now, woe unto us, who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. So they are familiar. These Philistines were familiar with the history of Israel and the place that the Ark of the Covenant had, especially during that 40-year wandering period. And so they were very familiar, and so they were reasonably and rightfully afraid. However, somebody spoke up and said, be strong, and quiet yourselves like men. Or in other words, basically put in the modern time, no, let's man up, O ye Philistines, that ye be not servants unto the Hebrews as they have been to you. Quiet yourselves like men and fight. And this is verse 10. Notice what happens in verse 10. And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten again, and they fled every man into his tent, and there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen. Now, think about that. After that, what I like to call that dynamic church services, where they shouted so much that the ground actually shook. They lost 3 times, no, like 10 times as many the second time as they did the first time. And so why was that? Because of course the sin that was in the camp. Now, and the ark of God, not only did they lose 30,000, this was a very bad day for the camp. And because in verse 11 says, not only did 30,000 footmen were slain in that one battle, it said that the ark of God was taken, and the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. Now, so again, because of the sin that was in the camp, and one of the things I just want to stick a pin right there to just kind of point out that one of the things that we have to be careful as believers, and of course we're admonished to rejoice in the Lord and worship God. But when we worship in sin and iniquity, especially if we're in leadership and you have other leaders in your ministry that are not living up to the standard, we as a leader we need to take accountability of that, and because we can't. Oftentimes people have a tendency to want to just shout and rejoice over that, just similar to what happens here in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel. But as believers, we want to kind of like especially in leadership, we want to avoid that, because there could be some dire consequences down the road. Because the Bible tells us that we should rejoice not in iniquity, but rejoice in truth. So that's an important lesson that we can get from 1 Samuel chapter 4. Now, upon hearing the news of his son's death, Eli also died, and if you recall the story, Eli, heard the news, fell back in his chair, and just died apparently of a heart attack. And later, Samuel's leadership and by God's power, the Philistines were overcome, and there was a time of peace between them. Now, again, that's showing this chart again, because just keep in mind, because we want to have a contextual reference as to what the text is talking about. That this is during that same time, that sin cycle. So now they had, because of Samuel, they had some deliverance, and they repented. They had some deliverance, and then of course, as we're going to see, this cycle would begin all over again. But only when it begins again the next time, it won't be under a judge, but it will be under the kingship. So now, the life of Samuel was a pivotal period in Israel's history, because he was and this was something interesting about Samuel, that he was a prophet who anointed the first 2 kings of Israel, and according to Acts 13 and 20, he was the last in the line of Israel's judges, and considered by many as being the greatest judge. Notice what it says in Acts 13 and 20. Luke, the writer of Acts, says, and after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. And one of the things also that's interesting about Samuel, because Samuel, not only did he serve as judge, not only did he serve as prophet, but he also served in the role of priest also. Because remember, he was serving and working with Eli in the tabernacle even from the time of his youth. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So Samuel was a very pivotal individual in the nation of Israel. So now, let's go to the second narrative. And this is, of course, the main and primary narrative in the book of 1 Samuel. And that is the rise and fall of King Saul. And of course, I like to highlight this particular section by the term "give us a king," because that's what the people demanded. They wanted a king. They didn't want to be under the judge, or they didn't want to be under the theocracy period any longer. They wanted a king. So they called Samuel, "Give us a king." So notice what what we are going to be getting into here. Now, beginning in chapter 8, Israel begins to transition from the period of the theocracy to the United Kingdom period. And I like to refer to, as I mentioned earlier, I like to refer to 1 Samuel chapter 8 as another one of the great transitional chapters in which they, we discussed those 7 periods of Israel's history, where it's clearly delineated between the 7 periods, and well, we can see that this particular transition is transitioning from the theocracy period, or period that's called God ruled, to the United Kingdom period. It's very clearly defined. It is nothing ambiguous about it. It's a clear and concise transition in their history from one period to the next period, and is clearly described in the 6th foundational book of 1 Samuel. So now let's just kind of take a look. The people of Israel came to Samuel and demanded that because Samuel was now an old man, that they wanted to have a king to rule them so that they could be like all the other nations. Now, notice what it says, and we're going to be getting to in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 1. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judge over Israel. Of course, that ended up not being a good move. Why? Because the names of his firstborn were Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. Then all of the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And verse 5 says, and they said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways." So they acknowledged, that when Samuel was in his strength, that he walked according to the ways of God. But his sons are not following in his footsteps. And of course, when we get into the kingship, we're going to see this kind of cycle also continue. Where you would have one king walk in the ways of the Lord, and then have a son who walks not in his father's ways. And we'll see that over and over again. But now they ask Samuel, "Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations." We want to be like all the nations. And verse 6, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord, and notice what the response was. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Heed the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For notice this, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them." So that's a very key verse right there. And that's, first of all, there's 2 things that I wanted to point out in that verse, which we touched on last week, and I just want to reiterate. And that is that the reason why we call the period of the judges the theocracy period. The theocracy period means God ruled, what that means, and is based on this verse, based on 1 Samuel 8 and 7. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So you remember, so this is they're closing out the period of the theocracy, the period of the judges, because they don't want God. So basically what it was saying, that God was ruling and judging through the judges and through the priests, like people like Samuel, and through the other judges. And so they didn't want that anymore. So they wanted a king to rule over them so they could be like all the other nations, which, by the way, God did not call them to be like all the other nations. God called them to be a separate, distinct, and different and unique people, but they wanted to be like all the other people. And so that, as we're going to see as we progress through this Old Testament study, did not necessarily work out great for them. So now, after warning the people of what type of king they would have, and what having a king would mean. Samuel anoints a Benjamite by the name of Saul, who is crowned as Israel's first king. And of course, Saul becomes king, and he's now the single leader over all 10 tribes. So he's the first single leader since Joshua, who even though Joshua was not a judge or a king, and neither was Moses for that example, but they did have authority over all the 12 tribes. But since that time, now for the first time we have a king. So Saul becomes the first king in response to the people's wishes. And so Saul would ultimately be rejected by God due to his disobedience. But however, initially Saul enjoyed some early success, and he won several battles in his early part of his kingship. And just to take an example, let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 47 through 48, just to kind of give you a flavor of some of the early successes that Saul had in his kingship. And verse 47 in chapter 14, it says, "So Saul took the kingdom over Israel, and he fought against all the enemies on every side, against Moab, and against the children of Ammon, and against Edom, and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines, and whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them." So in other words, he was just taking names. He was just making it do what it do, and early on in his kingship. And verse 48 says, "And he gathered a host and smote the Amalekites, and delivered Israel out of the hands of them that spoiled them." And that's 1 Samuel chapter 14, verses 47 and 48. And of course, in doing so, as we pointed out in that earlier chart, every one of these kingdoms that he defeated, now that's automatically expanding the territory of Israel, which kind of points to that map. And then David, of course, expands it even more. So, but then after his initial successes, Saul, he makes a series of some very, very serious mistakes that led to God taking his presence completely away from him. Now, one of the first mistake that he made is recorded in chapter 13, where he presumptuously offers burnt offerings at Gilgal, something that was only reserved to the priest. And remember, he was at the burnt offerings at the altar of burnt offerings. Only the priest was permitted to offer burnt offerings, and so Saul tried to presumptuously take on the role of a priest, which God had forbidden that to be done. And so that was violation number one. And then after that, he disobeys the Lord's direct command to not spare anyone or any animal after the defeat of the Amalekites. And if you remember that account, that's given in chapter 15, where he called himself doing a good thing by sparing King Agag and keeping the best of the livestock of the Amalekites. And so remember when Samuel comes in and he asks, and he hears the sound of the sheep in the background, and like, what meaning this that I'm hearing in my ear? There's no, and then I kept some of the best of the livestock of the Amalekites as a spoil, and I'm going to offer it. And his justification was, I'm going to offer it to the Lord, offer his sacrifice to the Lord, which is of course by a strict violation, because God had previously said that obedience is much better than sacrifice. And so, Saul, to bring me King Agag, and of course Saul, Samuel kills Agag himself, and so that was strike number two, and of course it was already going to go downhill for Samuel from there, because of course we know the story about how he gets jealous of David, but then he does something to pretty much seal his fate, and his fate was pretty much already sealed, but this final violation pretty much just it was a wrap. And he consults with the witch of Endor in chapter 28, and in that seance, that he had with the witch of Endor, Samuel's spirit rises from the dead and gave him one last prophecy. And Saul would, that prophecy was that Saul would die in the battle the next day. And of course, that came to pass that he died. Not only did he die, but his son Jonathan also died in that same battle. As a result of Saul's rebellion, God chooses another king. And of course, again, we're just doing a 10,000-foot view of the book of First Samuel. As a result, God chooses another king to take Saul's place. Now, of course, now we're just going back into the narrative just a little bit, and we're going to meanwhile point out that he was going to raise up a young man that we're going to look at here in a second. But meanwhile, God removes his blessing from Saul, and an evil spirit begins provoking Saul toward madness. He became like a fanatical madman. And Samuel then travels to Bethlehem to anoint a youth. So while he already knew that Samuel already knew that God had already taken his anointing away from Saul, and so he was already given instructions to go anoint another king. So Samuel then travels to Bethlehem to anoint a youth named David as the next king, and of course that's recorded in chapter 17, and thus begins the storyline of David, because later David had his famous confrontation with the giant Goliath, the Philistine, and he would become a national hero. And remember, this happens at a time where Saul is becoming more and more angry, more and more mad, more and more hostile, and of course, he was being oppressed rather by a demonic spirit, of course. And of course, sometimes David then serves, of course, in Saul's court. He marries Saul's daughter and befriended by Saul's son, Jonathan. And of course, David would be called because he would come to play the harp, because David was also a gifted musician. And so he would come to play the harp, and sometimes the soothing sound of the harp would calm Saul for a period of time, but then the madness would return. As a youth, now we're talking about David, now the rise of David. As a youth, as a young shepherd, David was known for his skill as a musician and a shepherd. And he was also known, of course, for his athletic and for his fighting skills, and his because you got to remember that he had. We're going to talk about David later in more depth next week when we get to 2 Samuel. But when we read about David and his Goliath, and we think of this as a young, skinny, scrawny little kid, but David actually, even though we don't have any images of him or any diagrams or real description of his physical presence, David would have had to have been a very gifted and genetically powerful young man, simply because of the things that he would accomplish throughout his career, as in terms of in the military, in his keeping his sheep, attacking lions and bears. Just things like that just an average Joe laying around just doesn't, aren't able to do. But he has some very unique abilities even before he was anointed by Samuel rather. So now let's look at his rise to fame. Of course, most of it we're familiar with, because he became a national hero after defeating the Philistine giant Goliath, a victory that inspired the Israelites. He gained prominence as a warrior and a musician in King Saul's court, and his popularity, however, incited Saul's jealousy, leading Saul in an attempt to kill David. And you remember, the storyline about after the fame about David went out so strong, and that Saul killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. And of course, that just infuriated Saul, who was already going mad, and so that just added fuel to the fire of his anger. And of course, he on multiple occasions tried to seek David's life. He tried to kill him, but God would protect him. So David fled from Saul, and he lived as a leader of outlaws actually for many years. And of course, that's in the story we're going to look at. We're going to kind of unpack next week when we get to 2 Samuel, where much of that is recorded. But after Saul died in battle, the leaders of Israel sought out David. And so between in the last years of Saul's life, and as David was being in his exploits as the leader of these outlaws, some of the things that he accomplished in terms of just from a military perspective, it continued to increase his fame and his popularity. And then the people would come to him and they sought David out. And of course, as we're going to learn next week, David wasn't, he served as for 40 years, but it wasn't 40 years over all 12 tribes. His first 7 years was he was only king over the southern tribe, the southern tribe. But then the other 10 tribes came and they wanted him to be king over all Israel. We'll look at that next week, and because that's a very, very important narrative that's a part of the big picture as it pertains to the Messiah. So that's very important that we take our time to unpack that, and we'll do that next week when we get to 2 Samuel. But he was the first anointed king over the tribes of Judah in Hebron, as I mentioned earlier. And then after a period of conflict with the house of Saul, he was anointed king over all Israel. And the seventh foundational book of 2 Samuel goes on to tell the story of David's anointing as king and the covenant that God makes with him. And it is that part where we're going to really want to highlight once we get to next week, because this covenant was referred to as the Davidic covenant, is one of the significant covenants outside of the Abrahamic covenant in the Old Testament, because it was through David's line that the Messiah would be born. And so I'm going to stop right there for tonight, and we're going to pick up next week with the continuing saga of the life of King David as we begin to unpack the seventh foundational book of 2 Samuel. So with that in mind, I just want to just point out again, for those, especially if you or those of you who are joining us for the first time, I have a resource that's on my website, bruceloganministries.com, and this resource is a PDF download study guide on this lesson that we're doing, God's Big Story of the Bible, Part 1, which is God's Big Story of the Old Testament. And of course, a Part 2 will be coming out at some point. But it's not a hard copy. It's important that I continue to point that out. It's a PDF download. It's 135 pages, so $14.95. And I did it as a PDF download because you'll be able to, if you download it, if you're a teacher, because I kind of designed this especially for individuals who are teachers, who are Sunday school teachers, or small group teachers, or pastors who want to do a sermon series and you want to have handouts, or any type of a scenario such as that. This is going to be perfect for you. You can print out certain sections and use for handouts, or you can just maybe do a series on a certain aspect, and it'll be a great tool and a great benefit. So now that's at bruceloganministries.com. Go to the store, $14.95, and you can download it right there. That being said, I want to just close with my my foundational passage of scripture that I love so much through everything that's centered around everything that we do in this ministry. The Acts 17:11, which says, I call it my trademark premise, which in Acts 17:11 says, now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true or not. That's Acts chapter 17 and verse 11. And one of the reasons why I love that passage so much is because first of all, it says that these Berean Jews were more noble of character. And the reason that they were associated as having more noble character was because of the fact of how they received the message. They received it with eagerness, and they said with great eagerness, But then not only did they receive the message with great eagerness, but they would go home and they would search the scriptures every day to see whether or not what Paul said was true. And what also makes this passage so just inspiring is because these Berean believers were being taught by the Apostle Paul, who's arguably the greatest theologian and the greatest teacher that ever lived, whose name was not Jesus Christ. And but yet, in spite of the fact that they had the Apostle Paul teaching them, they still saw fit to go and research and to study on their own to see whether or not and what Paul was teaching them was actually in the scriptures or not. And so if that can be done for the Apostle Paul, then all the Bruce Logans of the world and all of your other, whoever your favorite Bible teacher is, you want to be able to go back and study to see whether or not what we're saying or whoever your favorite teacher is saying is in the scriptures or not. And so that's why I love this verse so much, because basically my whole desire in this ministry is to create a community of Bereans. That's kind of my mission statement. I want to be able to create a community of Bereans, a community of individuals who are passionate to learn the Bible on another level, to beyond the traditional levels, beyond, the basic, elementary level, who really want to expand their understanding of scripture, who want to know the difference between eisegesis and exegesis, for an example, who want to just expand their knowledge. And that's basically the whole entire premise. And I love this verse, Acts 17 and 11. So with that being said, we're going to just close out here until next week. But before we do, if you like anything that we're sharing, we'd like for you to subscribe to this channel. And of course, once you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell, every time we get ready to go live, you'll receive a notification. And so you can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Facebook, I have Dr. Bruce Logan Ministries or DBL Ministries or at DBL Ministries. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Bruce Logan 1. And of course, don't forget, as we said already, don't forget to hit that bell and click that subscribe button so that you can be notified whenever we go live again. So with that said, I just want to maybe check, see that we have people here with Sister Joan. See, good to see you again. So anyway, we're going to close out tonight. We're going to see you again next week, and we're going to be looking at the book of 2 Samuel, and we're going to really unpack the life of David. Especially, we want to kind of focus and kind of hone our attention on the Davidic covenant, which is a very, very major covenant in the Old Testament. And so until next week, may God richly bless each and every one of you, and we'll see you next week.